Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So friends, what do you see on your screen right now? Do you see the architectural design of a house? Yes, you do. You see that the house has a ground floor, a first floor, multiple windows. Probably there are different rooms. And I think each room has to have its own decor, design, purpose, and so on and so forth. But what is interesting is, friends, this design is in the backdrop of a blue color, which is considered supposed to be, in architectural work, something called the blueprint. Now, generally, the blueprint for any such activity is taken out as a planned document, as a document that will be the basis on which construction of the house will commence, the design and the other aspects will actually take place. So, in this context, you will notice that the constitution or any such constitution, be it the Indian constitution or otherwise, is considered as a blueprint, right? It's like the kind of a four, corners of a box under which the entire country is going to be governed, right? Now, the four corners is what the constitution limits government, confines its powers and functions, and that is what the blueprint is precisely made of. So what is the size, what is the structure of the house, where, what, who should come into place, where the bedrooms have to be, where the master bedroom is, where the kitchen is, and so on and so forth. So the constitution is also a document that actually, to a larger extent, is a kind of a design document for what the country ought to do. Interestingly, in that context, you will understand that because countries and nations across the world are different, the society is different, requirements are different. Some countries may be small, some countries may be large. A lot of countries don't have the problem of recognizing official languages. India does have this challenge. And hence you will notice that in India, the constitution recognizes, we don't have a national language, please note it down, because the debate on the national language is also an interesting constitutional debate. Should India have a national language? And the choice was between declaring Hindi or Sanskrit as the national language, but then finally we did not adopt to do that. So the constitution and the framers of the constitution did suggest that it's better to declare official languages, because India is so vast and diverse in terms of its linguistic, diversity. And hence, declaring anything which is from Delhi. Of course, the North India is a Hindi heartland. Hindi is a dominant language, but not necessarily the case in South India or in Northeast. So a constitution displays that unique kind of a character of a nation. And hence you will notice that every country's constitution is going to be quite significantly different, right? For example, a house that is built in the United States is not the way Indians usually build a house. So similarly, I think the constitution is a reflection of the country, its diversity, its societal aspirations and challenges. And hence, there is a unique structure to the constitution, just as we have unique structure for buildings. So when you look at the study of comparative constitution, comparing Indian constitution, say, with American one or any other constitution, you will notice how uniquely some of these constitutions have been designed. Interestingly, the uniqueness will also be in relation to certain kinds of words. For example, just giving you the context of, say, what is due process of law, as against what we call as procedure established by law. Now, a lot of people will tell you that these both probably mean one and the same thing. But the word that is used and how it is kind of textualized in the Constitution is entirely different, right? Procedure established by law or the due process of law, right? So I think those very clearly tell you the kind of blueprint a constitution is able to make. Now, the blueprint for a residential, commercial, or landscape are entirely different, isn't it? Because commercial establishments should have parking, they must be more equipped to deal with fire hazard and so on and so forth. Landscaping is where you just. So I think the constitution of any country uh, has different parts to it, part 1 to part 10 or 11 or 12. Now, each of these parts has a purpose. Now, that purpose would mean that each of the part or the chapters in the Constitution may be worded differently, may be textualized differently. And that's something that one will have to take into context, because what is written in part 3 and part 4, I'm sure when you go further into the parts of the Indian Constitution itself, you'll find that the words that are used in many of these other parts of the Constitution are not stricto sense interpreted in the same way like the part 3 is done. Okay, because part 3 is that is of the fundamental right. It's about your residence. You cannot be kicked out. It's about your fundamental rights. It's so core and concern. So I think that is something that we'll have to understand as we go further in our discussion as well. Of course, you will notice that the Constitution cannot be said to be a civil law document, right? To a larger extent, I think the Constitution is also not a criminal law. It's kind of a special law, but more important, it's not special for the purpose that it is special against gender. It is more in terms of the foundational law. So you will notice that the blueprint of any constitution is a unique blueprint, and that creates what the constitution fairly represents in terms of public opinion, right? So that's very important for us to appreciate at this point of time. Of course, the constitution will hold people in power accountable towards the people that they attempt to serve. At this point of time, I just wanted to state very clearly that it's very important for us to understand distinction between a government servant vis-a-vis a public servant. To be honest, friends, public administration is all about the powers of the public servant. Now, very often than not, the term public in public administration and in public servant is not something that people have appreciated or understood in the real context of the term. The term public servant means that you are here to serve the people. So you may be a person with power, but the power has to be held responsibly and in the beneficial interest of the public. That is the quintessential of what anyone must hold in the bureaucracy and try and call themselves as a public servant. So, very often than not, people in public administration say, I'm a government servant. Yes, to some extent that is true, because government is your employer. But you're not a servant of the government, because in a democratic country like India, please note, in other constitutions and jurisdictions, you may be a government servant per se, because you don't represent the people's opinion. You don't allow for a democratic process. You may not be a public servant. You may just be serving the government and be very loyal to the government and not to the people at large. Because in India, we think government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. The government has no other existence of its own. It has to just function for, by, and of the people. That's what the government is. And any government servant has to only go by, of, by, and for principle. And hence, I think a government servant is employed by the government. The government is their master, but government servants' accountability is towards the people at large. So, if they hold public administration, every action of public administration should be in furtherance of the people they serve. And that is what the Constitution must emphasize, insist, and actually try and hold accountability to. That is very critical in terms of public administration. Going further, friends, this interesting debate about evaluating the constitutions of the world. This was, clearly something that is designed by what initially Aristotle, a jurist, a philosopher, and a political thinker, had to actually look into. Interestingly, he thought some of the good constitutions could be an aristocracy as well. He thought monarchism or monarchs can be, if the head of the government is a monarch, that can still be considered as a good constitution. But where the constitution promotes tyranny or oligarchy, he believed that that is definitely a bad constitution. Unfortunately, the Russian Federation sometimes is always kind of alleged to have created rich oligarchs. And that, to a larger extent, people say is actually a result of the bad constitution. Of course, there are so many countries where there has been civil war, maybe in Africa or in Arab world. Though sometimes they have a constitution, but it has never led into an accountable administration. So maybe the constitution has not worked, and tyranny has been the basis of rule over the people, and the beneficial interest of the people or the welfare interest of the people have not been so-called emphasized. That is definitely something you would say. Now, the good and the bad constitution, friends, is probably a kind of evaluation based on the performance of the constitution. For example, today, if we have to take the test of the Indian constitution as good or bad, I think the Indian constitution would be rated as excellent. For the simple reason is that we have not been disturbed with the democratic process ever in this country, despite the fact that we had one kind of a black incident in the democratic process by the imposition of emergency in the 1975s. But nevertheless, I think our constitution has been able to protect the democratic values, the democratic structure. Institutional governance has been in place, and people-centric welfare measures have always been promoted in India. So I think in terms of performance, good or bad can always make a sense. But to be honest, I think what Aristotle wanted to do in terms of classification of constitution was to test whether a constitution is weak. When I say weak, it means that the constitution is not sufficiently strong enough of bringing the classes of institutions, or what we call as the agencies under the constitution, accountable under the constitution. So that I would consider to be a weak constitution. So if your government cannot be held accountable under the constitution, or if your government does not have respect to the constitution, or the principles of the constitution are not given the highest sacrosanct privileges, or the kind of faith you must show as a society, saying that the constitution is the ultimate document, no man is above law, rule of law, and the rule of constitutional law is the only basis of governance, then I think we make a decision between good, bad, but I think more importantly, a strong versus a weak constitution. Generally, I think constitutions across the world are rated as strong and weak, and a lot of the constitutions in Europe are considered to be strong constitutions. The constitutions of Australia, Canada, and the United States are also considered as very strong constitutions. I think wherever you see political battles, political struggle, you don't see growth and development. You don't see protection of human rights. You don't see accountability of government. You see civil war. You see dictatorship, if I can bring in that terminology, because a lot of countries that have dictators also have a constitution, but it's just constitution on paper. It is not a constitution that is followed at all. So I think the strength of the constitution will make it a good constitution. The weakness of the constitution will definitely make it a bad constitution. And I think how good a country is in terms of economic, social, and cultural growth will probably be one of the elements to bring in the element of a strong constitution. And I believe that to a larger extent, when we look at indexes like the happiness indexes, which country the people are more happy, I think there can be a credit to strong constitution as against weak constitution as well. Because I think when you say welfare state, the welfare of the people will definitely ensure happiness of the people as well.
So if one looks at the history of constitution making, one would date it back to 1215, when a document called the Magna Carta was signed as the first step towards looking at some form of constitutionalism in Europe. Magna Carta is probably one of the first human right documents where citizens demand rights and insist on duties from the state or the crown. King John of England was forced to sign this by his barons. What did the Magna Carta do? As a document, it laid down certain principles of one that the administration, which is so-called the king or the monarch, must follow due process of law, because that is the most important principle. Due process of law clearly means that when a law is made, only that will be followed and applied, and nothing else then apart from that. So the law must lay down, and I think that will take down any kind of arbitrariness or unfairness or unjustness. And that becomes one very important way of protection of rights. So Magna Carta laid down the due process. Second, it laid down fair trial because it was very important for the administration of justice to have a fair trial in terms of not holding someone guilty before the evidence regarding the same is adduced. And everyone should have an opportunity to defend himself or herself. So the fair trial process was something that Magna Carta insisted upon, and the origin of the writ of habeas corpus, which is a writ, a part of Article 32 of the Constitution of India, was also brought about in this document. Now, why is Magna Carta so important? Is because it is the kind of a declaration of Bill of Rights of citizens. It was a freedom from tyranny of the monarch. It was a document that will be the guiding light for administration, especially by the king at that point of time. And hence, you will notice that doing administration by the book of law, the letter of law, was something that you can always trace it down to Magna Carta. Following the same, you will notice that the Statute of Westminster in 2097 was also brought into effect. This was clearly a shift of power from the king, who till that point of time wielded the most majority of powers in terms of deciding what the law is and applying the law, and handing it over to the people in terms of the commons or the common men and their representatives, who could then decide what is just and unjust in a society. The Statute of Westminster was also critical because it brought in a collective responsibility in terms of lawmaking. The true spirit of parliamentary democracy can be traced to the Statute of Westminster. However, the modern constitution, please note this is where the idea of constitutionalism grew in the United Kingdom, but United Kingdom even to this day does not have a perfectly written constitution as one document that we may refer to. But the modern day constitution, credit must go to John Adams in the United States from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which in 1780, this was a state. This state had a constitution which was then later translated into the United States of American Constitution, which was written in 1787 and it came into effect in 1789. So the US Constitution can be considered to be the kind of mother of modern day constitutional governance, and 1789 is when the US got a constitution to itself. And I think the process of constitutional governance in modern times can be completely credited to how the United States gave a framework for modern democracies to adopt a constitutional basis of governance. Moving further, what can be the structure of the Indian Constitution, or what is the structure of the Indian Constitution? You will notice that, broadly, this is how it looks, especially in terms of the public administration structure that the Constitution lays down. Of course, what is the Constitution for? As I told you in the past, it is for people and the government. Of course, we have the legislatures, executive and judiciary. The roles of the three organs of the government have been very clearly stipulated. The parliament, the state legislature are the two organs of the legislature. But please note today under local government as well, you have the local councils that can also bring in certain kinds of bylaws for governance in urban local bodies as well. You have the executive, the president and the governor. Please note they are considered the chief executive of each of the respective governments. The president is the chief executive of the central government and the governor is the chief executive of the state government. We have two constitutional courts, Supreme Court and High Court, and the subordinate courts are also play a very important role, like the subordinate executive does play an important role as well. So these are broadly how the structure of government is under the Constitution of India, mostly in other jurisdictions as well, where there is a federal kind of government, which is on the basis of Constitution. Quickly, what does the Constitution provide for? It definitely provides for governance and administration. After it provides for the governance and administration, it provides for what is the rule for the polity. So, as people, what are our rules of governance? For example, I would just say the rules of polity today include not only fundamental rights, but you also have fundamental duties under Article 51A. Though 51A was not part of the original Constitution, friends, fundamental duties were added to the Constitution, and I would say today, if we speak about how constitutionalism has grown up in India or has advanced in India, from a time where we were actually fighting for our basic rights, and let me tell you how the generation of rights came about. We say that there are four generations of rights. The first generation of rights are considered to be civil and political rights. The world fought for it. It's not something that only India did. I think the world did so, and it was kind of a transformation of the political class and the political society in India. We fought for basic rights like should I have a say in my government? Should I be able to elect my own government? When we say we the people, what does it actually mean? So, exercising your vote or your adult franchise or creating your ways of expressing an opinion in the public, all of these were considered to be civil and political rights. Freedom of speech and expression is an integral part of the civil and political rights structure. Because as a human being, you must have the basic right to speech, at least, and that should be ensured as a fundamental right in the Constitution. So, I think we kind of fought for the civil and political rights. There was a stage and a generation that sacrificed a lot to gain civil and political rights. For example, in many countries, the right to vote for women was absent. So, gender rights, especially even in democratic processes, was absent in a lot of constitutions across the world. So women got to vote or right to vote quite later than men could do it. Also, just the basic amount of freedom, for example, getting independence from the Britishers could be part of your civil and political rights structure. You don't want an external government, you don't want a government imposed by the crown, you want your own people as elected representatives, you want your own citizens to rule you. So I think these were the basic struggles as the first generation of people or citizens under any constitution actually struggled for. The second generation of rights that citizens did kind of strengthen were considered to be social, cultural and economic rights. So under this category, you will notice that cultural rights meant my right to food. It could be any kind of cultural rights in terms of expressing my religion, expressing my movement. Right to movement is a fundamental right. Right to assembly can also be my fundamental right. Marriage and other institutional reforms, and various aspects of, say, does an Indian have the freedom to travel abroad? Right? Can the government, decide when should I travel and what should I do? So I think social, economic, and cultural rights, and you will notice that internationally and nationally, the second generation of citizens under the Constitution actually fought to expand these kinds of rights. We wanted freedom of ideas, freedom of expression, of thought, and I think there was a lot that went into these kinds of rights as the second generation citizens would actually want to bring in. The third generation of rights, where I think, post what in India we would call as the LPG era, 1991, where we talked about liberalization of the economy. I think Constitution and the LPG era is an interesting discussion over there, because we did move away from a little bit of socialism to a little bit of capitalism by LPG. And I think, it is a matter of another day in another chapter, where we will probably speak and evaluate socialism as a very, not a basic core principle, because please note, socialism is an important part of the preamble of the Constitution. It also talks about the rule of the polity. Because in India, let's assume socialism as something the state would provide. If the state will be a facilitator, the state will be, probably, producing goods and services. Because we were influenced so much of socialism as this part of the world was and is, to be honest. Suppose you take Russia, China, and India as the eastern part, as the big countries in the eastern part of the country, you will notice that socialism is a great influencer. The Marxism is a great influencer, and India was influenced by socialism post-independence, and I think socialism became part of the Indian polity for quite some time. But later on, post-1991, I think there was liberalization of the economy, there was privatization, there was globalization thanks to India being part of the World Trade Organization. We opened up our borders for foreign investors, foreign goods. We wanted to make the world a marketplace. So you will notice that the third generation of rights became very, very critical and important, and they would constitute something like the right to environment. Because as soon as you thought about Bhopal gas disasters, and then you wanted to speak about what is the next generation of rights that citizens have. Right to health, see, right to life, you gave it under civil and political. Right to equality, you may give it under civil and political. Right to press, you may give it under civil and political. The press freedom was very important for civil and political rights to be there, because you wanted the government to be civilized and the press could hold that to be account. So freedom of press, and you will notice there are so many Supreme Court judgments under Article 19(1)(a) that ensured the freedom of press as the first generation of civil and political rights. But coming from there to, say, talking about right to environment, then interestingly talking about right to health, I think, the fact is, when the third generation of rights came into place, you will notice that the quality of life, it's not just right to life, but the quality of life started getting spoken about quite rigorously, and the citizens started demanding the same. That is the third generation effect. So interestingly, friends, while we speak about right to development, for example, you may talk about the principles of sustainable development vis-a-vis environment, but right to development is an important right. It is probably one of those things that we must achieve through the Millennium Development Goals. Right, every state has to have such kind of targets. So to that extent, you will notice that right to development, right to environment, right to health became the third generation of rights, and the Constitution started providing for the same. And you will notice that we started experiencing so many other facets. Okay, of course, there was a struggle in the initial days. Just getting a state, form a state, we struggled. Then asking the state to give us some cultural facilities like theaters and parks was a struggle. Then we came to an era where we said, no, the state better take care of public health. They have to ensure that doctors give first aid as an emergency care. That is also very critical and important, because you will notice that emergency care is the bedrock of saving life. And we did not only demand these rights from the government, we also demanded it from citizens across the society. So you will notice that in the Paramananda Katara case, the Supreme Court said that doctors cannot reject a patient. They have to stabilize the patient, especially in accident cases, in emergency cases, and that is their duty under the Constitution. Now, interestingly, friends, I think the third generation rights have stabilized, and we are actually, as we take this course, in the era of fourth generation of rights. Now, you must be wondering, sir, what is the fourth generation of rights? The fourth generation of rights, friends, today is the digital rights.
Now, digital rights are very critical because today we are all online. This course is online. There are a lot of challenges to digitalization of our public life, if you would want to call it. What is that digitalization and public life and public administration online? You will notice that maybe the right to privacy, data protection is fourth generation right. So when you talk about right to privacy, there are so many dimensions to right to privacy. It's not bodily privacy; it's informational privacy. And you're talking about the responsibilities of institutions like Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, LinkedIn, so many others, where my personal data is available. But these companies may not be territorially bound by the rule of law in this country. Fourth generation of rights could include same-sex marriage, as LGBTQ is demanding today from the Constitution, declaration, as the case may be. So I think the rules of the polity is what the Constitution provides for: governance and administration, unity in diversity, and protection of rights of people. I think the Constitution is a document that actually gets into some of these aspects, along with the duties of citizens, duties of the state. The directive principles of state policies are precisely what the duty of the state to be. And I think all of these play a very, very critical and an important role about how the Constitution is the framework document, is that box under which every player in the game has to play. Anything that is out of the box, you can think out of the box, but you should not act out of the box, will be definitely unconstitutional and will probably be considered to be illegal, invalid, void to the extent that is possible. Let's now get into a very interesting, chart, as we would want to call it. And this chart is important because it may give you an idea that the Constitution of India was inspired by all the constitutions of the world. Yes, because that is the best way to do a constitution. You pick the best from the world's constitution. And when I say world constitution, I'm not talking the UN Charter. I'm talking about the world's constitution in other democracies. And on the left side that you see on the screen is all that inspired the constitutional drafting in India. The first and the foremost document that helped the drafters of the Indian Constitution. Please note, when I say drafters, I don't give the sole credit to the drafters alone. I think the credit should go to the Constituent Assembly. The drafters were the ones that created the expression of the Assembly. That's all, right? And while the drafters should get credit, absolutely, they are considered to be the fathers of the Constitution. But it was the Constituent Assembly that actually gave us the Constitution, because they debated. They kind of decided what is good and bad for the country. And the total strength of the Constituent Assembly was nearly 389 members. And they were supposed to be kind of, elected members, but not directly though. And you will notice that there is a lot that went into who should be part of this Constituent Assembly. So it was not that very easy. And I think finally, when it came to how this was made, how it was divided, you will notice that out of the 389 members of the Constituent Assembly, 296 seats were allotted to the rest of the India, whereas 93 seats were given to the princely states in India. Unfortunately, the princely states did not take part. So I think finally it was left to 292 members who came from 11 different provinces to actually decide what to give in the Indian Constitution. So the idea of the Constituent Assembly itself arises in 1934. So this is something that a lot of people don't realize and understand. They think that the Constituent Assembly idea came about in 1947 and in 48 everything was completed. It is not true. I think the first idea was given by Sri M.N. Roy in 1934. He said that we need a Constituent Assembly to officially ask for a constitution to frame the Indian Constitution. Following M.N. Roy in 1934, please note, Pandit Nehru in 1938, he, on behalf of the Indian National Congress, declared that India requires a constitution free from the Britishers so that they can govern themselves. And in 1940, I think the British government agreed to the demand to have a constituent assembly, and this was called the August Offer. And the cabinet, actually, the British cabinet came up with a proposal which was, of course, not accepted. This was the time during World War II. And then the Indian government said, no, look, we don't want a proposal framed by the Britishers as the constitution. We would actually want to frame it ourselves. So that is the kind of history to the Constituent Assembly. There are many such aspects that I'll tell you as we go further. But at this point of time, just quickly to cursorily look at, say, one. Please note, where did the idea of federal scheme, governor and judiciary and public service commission come in the Constitution of India currently? I think the credit should go to the Government of India Act of 1935. The Government of India Act was repealed later on, but that was the basis on which we fought for our independence, though it took another 12 years for us to gain full independence, rather 13 years, 1948 I can say precisely, where we started gaining that kind of independence. So that's precisely what the Government of India Act has given, the federal scheme, the governor and judiciary. We looked up to the British Constitution, the unwritten one, for parliamentary form of government, the rule of law principle. Of course, very importantly, single citizenship. We never wanted to give, you can't say dual, but we don't have a state citizenship in India. So it's only one Indian citizenship that is important. So British had the same. Other constitutions actually give more than one, but they have removed it as we go forward. Writs, especially the writ of habeas corpus, mandamus, certiorari, prohibition and quo warranto comes from the British Constitution. And most interestingly, quite controversially rather, parliamentary privileges we also borrowed from the British constitutional principle. US Constitution gave us fundamental rights. It talked about judicial independence and impeachment of judges. That is what the US Constitution inspired us. The Irish Constitution talked about the directive principles of state policy and the Rajya Sabha's role. The Canadian Constitution talked about federation with strong centre. That is what we got it. Don't forget that residuary powers, advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court also comes from the Irish Constitution.